Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Plazak. What we're going to be talking about in this video series is the brain. And everyone thinks that this is a very difficult topic. I'm going to break this down for you and kind of simplify it. I'm not going to go over every little minute detail of the brain. I'm going to kind of keep this simple so you have a general understanding of the different parts of the brain and some of the different functions of those different parts of the brain. I'm also going to break down the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system so you have a better understanding of how we break down those two components of the nervous system. So the first thing we got to do is you got to kind of develop a basic function as to what the purpose of the nervous system is. And the nervous system basically is going to take in information. That's your sensory input. And you do that with your senses. So your sense of smell, your sense of touch, your sense of hearing, your vision, your sense of taste. That's your sensory input. So you're going to gather this information, you're going to take in this information, and then you process this information. Okay, your brain's going to process this information, and then you're going to respond. That's the integration component of it. So basically what's going on is you're taking in information, and this next slide does a great job of explaining that. They can see right here. So basically you're going to take in information. That's the sensory input, is the taking in of information. And then we process this information. That's that integration component. And then when we process that information, we're going to respond in some manner. And that's going to be the actual motor output is what we're going to have there. So we take in the information, we process the information, and then we have that information that we process, we have a motor output. We're going to respond into some type of muscle, whether that's skeletal muscle, whether that's cardiac muscle, whether that's smooth muscle, or we're going to fire these electrical impulses into a gland is what we're going to do. So that's kind of how the nervous system operates. Sensory information being taken in, processing that information, and then we respond to that information that we are processing. So structurally, we break down the nervous system into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system is what we do. We have the central nervous system that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord is the central nervous system. And the function of the brain and the spinal cord is the command center, is what it's going to do. It's basically going to interpret this incoming sensory information that it's being bombarded with on a daily basis. And then what it's going to do as a result of that sensory information it takes in is it's going to issue outgoing instructions. So that's kind of the job of the central nervous system, is to take in this sensory information, process this sensory information, and then it's going to issue outgoing instructions. So if the brain and spinal cord is your central nervous system, then what the heck is the peripheral nervous system? It's simplified as PNS. Your central nervous system is known as the CNS. But the peripheral nervous system are basically nerves. And they're nerves that are coming off of the brain, and they're nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. A lot of people get confused and they forget that you actually have nerves that come off your brain. You think about the optic nerve that you have that's coming off of the brain. Then you have a variety of nerves that are coming off of your spinal cord. So these nerves come off of your brain, they come off of your spinal cord. These nerves are going to be sending impulses to your brain, and these nerves are going to be sending impulses away from your brain is what they are going to do. Remember, a nerve is a collection of neurons located outside of the central nervous system. So the true definition of a nerve is just a collection of neurons that are located outside the central nervous system. So these are nerves. These are neurons outside of the brain, and neurons located outside of the spinal cord. So we have spinal nerves. These are nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. And then we have cranial nerves. These are nerves that are coming off of the brain. Basic function, they kind of act like a... Basic function is going to be serving as a communication lines among sensory organs is what they're going to be doing. So they act as a communication line. Hey, this is what's going on. This is what's going on outside of these sensory organs. And it's also going to alert muscles and glands when we want to respond. That's kind of what you can kind of think of it as electrical wiring. Is kind of how I envision it. You have this electrical wiring that's running to your brain, and you have this electrical wiring that's running away from your brain and your spinal cord. So next thing we kind of got to understand is how we break down the peripheral nervous system. We break down the peripheral nervous system into the sensory division, it's also called the afferent, and the motor division, which is called the efferent. So you have the afferent and you have the efferent. Your sense organs are going to be sending information to the central nervous system. So these sense organs send this information to the central nervous system, where in the central nervous system we process this information. How are we going to respond? And then when we respond to the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. It's also called the efferent that we have. So you have the sensory information that's being sent to the central nervous system. We process that information in the central nervous system and respond via the motor division is what we're going to respond to. Now, with the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, we have to divide this even further to make it even more confusing, because sometimes we have to do that in human anatomy, physiology, as we make things really, really complex. But this really isn't too bad. If we're firing into skeletal muscle, as far as that motor division is concerned of the peripheral nervous system, all right, that's what we call the somatic, okay? So that's the somatic division of the motor component of our peripheral nervous system. So where am I firing? Oh, I'm firing into skeletal muscle. That's what we call somatic, okay? And for the most part, that is completely voluntary, meaning it requires conscious thought for us to be able to fire into skeletal muscle. And what that means is I constantly have to think about moving my arms, moving my legs, things like that, because I'm firing into that skeletal muscle. I know not all the time. We talk about these things like somatic reflexes, which are reflexes that don't get processed in the brain per se, but they do go to the spinal cord. So if I'm firing into skeletal muscle, that's what we call the somatic. If I'm firing into smooth muscle, okay, if I'm firing into cardiac muscle, or I'm firing into glands, that's what we call the autonomic. You can think autonomic, automatic. It happens automatically. It's not involving your conscious thought in order for this to be able to occur. This would be things like your heartbeat would be a prime example of this. Peristalsis of your esophagus and things like that, getting that, churning that food down into your stomach. Things that don't require conscious thought that happen automatically. And when we're firing into this cardiac and this smooth muscle, that's called the autonomic, as well as these glands that we could fire into and to get a response from them. Now, we break down the autonomic into two separate components, and you can kind of think of these as rest and digest and putting your foot on the gas. So we can think of this autonomic as controlling our unconscious thought is probably the best way to explain it. And when we're regulating this unconscious thought, sometimes we like to speed things up. So sometimes we like to speed things up, and we call that like our fight or flight. So we can kind of think of like our heart rate really beating, really going and doing those things. And that's going to be the sympathetic division of the autonomic. Is what it's going to be. So the sympathetic division is like, hey, let's speed things up. Let's really ramp this up. Let's really do this. So it's called your fight or flight is what it's going to do. Whereas your parasympathetic is kind of like rest and digest. Hey, let's slow things down. Let's really not go all out. Let's kind of rest. And let's kind of take a break and let's digest some things is what it's going to do. So your sympathetic is always like, hey, let's do this. Let's really do this. Let's ramp things up. Whereas your parasympathetic kind of acts like the brake. So you think of one as kind of the gas pedal and the other one kind of sitting there as a brake when we take a look at these. The sympathetic is called your fight or flight. And then the parasympathetic is the one that acts more like your rest and digest and braking is what it's going to do. So you can kind of think about like a time like you might have experienced like when you're in a crisis situation or something like that, and you notice that, everything got amped up, like my heart rate increased, my pupils began to dilate even more and things like that. My body began to release a whole bunch of adrenaline and stuff like that. That'd be your sympathetic division firing up. And then your parasympathetic is be like your brake pedal that you have. You can kind of think of like after you eat like a Thanksgiving meal or something like that. And we kind of increase that blood flow to our digestive organs and things like that. And we kind of get sleepy and stuff like that. But it's acting more like a break, like, hey, we have to slow down. Hey, we have to rest. Hey, we have to take a break. So after that heart rate's like going really, really, really fast, you have to have something that's going to slow your heart rate down as well and acts like that brake pedal, like after that crisis moment is over, now, okay, now we can put the brakes on. Now we can slow things down. Now we can rest is what you have. So the sympathetic acts like the gas, and the parasympathetic acts like the brakes. So you can think of the sympathetic, like I said, acts like the gas, and we'll write the gas in here. This acts like the gas. Okay, so this is your gas. And we think of the parasympathetic that's over here, acts more like your braking system that you have. So this is more like your braking system that you have. And you need both of them. You need a gas pedal, okay, to speed things up, and you need a braking system to slow things down. So they kind of work together. One just speeds things up, and the other one kind of slows things down. So let's take a look at this again to make sure that we completely understand what's going on here. Because if you can kind of understand this, things kind of make sense. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, the peripheral nervous system is divided into your sensory, okay, which we call the afferent because it's taking in information and sending information to the central nervous system. And then you have your motor division, or your motor division is also called your efferent, which is sending information away from the central nervous system. When we're sending information away from the central nervous system, we're going to fire into skeletal muscle, which we call somatic, or we're going to fire into cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, which we call the autonomic, okay? Autonomic, think automatic, things that are happening as a result of your unconscious thought. Also could be firing these neurons into glands as well. Prime example is firing into release adrenaline is a prime example of that. And then as we look further down here, we take this autonomic and we break it down into the gas, which is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, one speeding things up and the other one is slowing things down. So now let's take a look at the brain in greater detail. That's what we're going to do next. We're really going to take and home in and take a look at the brain. The brain I'm going to show you now is a sheep brain, and we're going to kind of take a look at the major parts of the brain. All right, so we have this major top portion of our brain that's right here. Okay, this whole top portion of the brain, it's most of the brain's mass. So over half of our brain's mass is in this area that we call the cerebrum. It's this area here that controls all of our conscious thought and reasoning. So this whole giant area right here is going to control our conscious thought and reasoning. When you look at the cerebrum, you see it has like a worm-like appearance that's associated with it. It has these ridges and grooves. The ridges that we call, that I'm pointing to right now, this is a ridge right here. This ridge that we're looking at right here, that's what we call a gyre. And then the grooves tend to be a little bit darker right here. Those are called sulci that we have. So we have these ridges that are called gyre. We have these grooves that are called sulci. Think sulci sink. Think sulci sink. Sulci sink. You go into a sulci. You sink. It's a shallow groove that's here. So the purpose of these ridges and grooves mainly is to increase the surface area of the brain. If I increase the surface area, it can withhold or withstand or be capable to hold more information. An interesting thing is when you look at Alzheimer's patients, these gyri and sulcuses become less. Your brain becomes a lot more smooth when you have advanced onset of Alzheimer's disease. Now you're going to notice right down the middle of the brain, you have a very deep, deep, deep groove that's here. Now that's not a sulci, because a sulci is a shallow groove. A deep groove that we have right here that's dividing the right and the left hemisphere of the cerebrum is what we call a fissure. So a deep groove is what we call a fissure. A shallow groove is called a sulci. Remember, this ridge structure is called a gyre. So you have gyre, you have sulci, and then you have this deep, deep, deep groove that we call a fissure. Now we take this brain and we divide it into lobes. So we take the cerebrum and we divide it into lobes. This lobe on the side right here is called the temporal lobe. The lobe on the front right here, this is called the frontal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe that's running up here. Okay? Back here we have a lobe that's called the parietal lobe. And in the very back of the cerebrum we have the occipital lobe. So the major lobes that we have with the cerebrum are the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. Remember, the job of the cerebrum, this is where all your conscious thought and reasoning is located at. As I move back here, we have another structure of the brain that doesn't have this worm-like appearance, whereas these grooves tend to just go a little bit more laterally across the back of this thing. This structure here is called my cerebellum. So this is my cerebellum that's hanging out here. And this is where your balance and posture is going to be controlled at. your balance and posture is going to be controlled in this area here, this whole little structure right here that we call the cerebellum. The cerebellum's going to, when I say balance and posture, that's kind of generalized. We kind of want to explain this a little bit more. So the cerebellum is basically going to help coordinate your motor movements and make sure that they're really smooth, is what it's going to do. So you have smooth transitioning, like your muscles, like everything's going kind of like moving in a smooth-like fashion. There's not herky and jerkiness that's associated with your movements. And that's what your cerebellum is going to do. It's going to coordinate these movements. And I kind of call the cerebellum like a Dr. Smooth. That's going to make sure that everything kind of goes nice and easy. Not necessarily easy, but everything goes in a fluid type of motion that we have. So that's the job of this structure right here. That's the cerebellum. When you look at different animals, you'll see like their size of their cerebellum increases in size, especially like when you look at a cat that has really good balance. It has like a giant cerebellum in comparison to its cerebrum. It has a good sized cerebrum, but its cerebellum, you notice, is quite substantial as far as size is concerned. So that's this structure right here. Cerebellum, balance and posture, smooth coordinated movements is what's occurring in this structure that's right here. Now when I move on the underside of the brain, I'm going to take a look at this structure right here, and this is my brain stem. So this structure right here is my brain stem, and then my brain stem is going to fuse eventually with my spinal cord, is what's going to happen. So this structure here is my brain stem. My brain stem is divided into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So this brain stem is going to control some of your vital functions. It's going to control your heart rate. It's going to help control your breathing rate. It's going to help control your ability to swallow. It's going to help control your ability to vomit. It's also going to serve as some of these areas serve as reflex centers for vision, and hearing. So this is kind of like your vital functions. A lot of your vital functions are controlled in this area of your brain that is called the brain stem. So I just introduced you guys to the cerebrum, and then I showed you the brain stem, and then I showed you the cerebellum. Now there's this other term that's here that's called the diencephalon, which is on the inside of the brain. So when we look at the inside of the brain, we can see this purple structure. It kind of looks like a turkey right here that you can see. This structure right here that's in purple, it looks like a turkey. Okay, right there's the beak of the turkey. Right here's the gobbler of the turkey. But that is the diencephalon that's there. I'm going to take a look at that just a little bit later. But we're really going to zoom in now on the cerebrum is what we're going to take a look at in a little bit more detail and kind of point out some of the key areas of it and kind of the basic functions of some of these areas that we have in the cerebrum. So we take a look at the cerebrum. The cerebrum comes in pairs. There's a right hemisphere and there's a left hemisphere. The hemispheres are divided by those deep grooves that we call fissures. We talked about the gyri. The gyri are the ridges. The sulci are the grooves that we have. Those are there to increase surface area. The cerebrum has these gyri and sulcuses. Remember, the cerebrum's going to control our conscious thought, is what it's going to do. This is a picture of your cerebrum up here. That's in color. And we can see when we look at the cerebrum, we divide the cerebrum into different lobes. We can see this lobe right here is called our frontal lobe. Then we have this lobe over here, that is our parietal lobe. Then we have this lobe that is back here, that is our occipital lobe. Then we have this lobe that is right here, that is our temporal lobe. So we have our temporal lobe, our occipital lobe, our parietal lobe, and our frontal lobe are the lobes of the cerebrum that we have. Again, here we're talking about fissures again. Fissures having those deep grooves. They divide the cerebrum into the right and the left hemisphere. Also, these fissures are going to be division lines too. They help us identify where the different lobes of the brain are at. A lot of your major blood vessels run in these fissures as well. We talked about the frontal, parietal, occipital, and the temporal lobe. So now we're going to take a look at some of the specialized areas within the cerebrum. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is the primary somatic sensory area. Remember, somatic, we're going to stimulate skeletal muscle is what we're going to stimulate. And then we have the primary motor area is what we have. So the primary somatic sensory area, sorry, I misspoke there. But the primary somatic sensory area is where we're going to receive information as far as our sense of touch is concerned. Okay, so this is where we're going to receive information as far as our sense of touch is concerned. This is where we're going to process that particular information at, is in our primary somatic sensory area. And then we have our primary motor area, which is going to be able to stimulate skeletal muscle. So this is the area that we're going to process information that we're going to stimulate our skeletal muscle. This Broca's area that's here, I'm going to talk about that just in a little bit. What we can see here on the brain, on the back of the frontal lobe, we have this area here that we call the motor cortex. And then on the front of the parietal lobe, we have this area here that is going to be the sensory cortex that we have. So the primary motor cortex is going to control our motor movement, is what it's going to do. So it's going to control our motor movement. So this side over here of this diagram right here is going to control our motor movement, is what we have. So over here is our motor movement that we have. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit so we can take a look at it. So when we look at this right here, you can see this is going to control our motor movement that we have right here. So this is the brain, and I often tell kids it's like you have an upside down human being on your motor cortex. So the lower that you go on the cerebrum, towards the back of the frontal lobe, this is going to control your head region that's here. Okay, and then as you move further up, then we get to our arms, and then as we get really high up here, this is going to control your legs. You can see on the cerebrum, as far as the motor cortex, a lot of space is dedicated to coordinating the muscle movement of our face. Our face has a lot of movement that's associated with it, because with your face, it's a way that we as human beings are able to communicate with one another, and it allows us to show expression and things like that, how we feel, and people can interpret that. So our face has a lot of area that's dedicated to it on that cerebrum. Again, the motor cortex, if you're confused, and I did a horrible job of explaining this, the motor cortex is basically going to control the movement of your skeletal muscle. Okay, it's going to control the motor movement. So when I go to think about, oh, I'm going to move my arm, okay, that thought process started in that motor cortex, and then I move my arm, and it's going to go down an association neuron, which I'll talk about neurons in a little bit, but these are association neurons for the most part in your brain where I'm processing this information. Then I'm going to communicate via a motor neuron, and then I'm going to move my particular arm that's there. Your sensory cortex that you have is located on the front of the parietal lobe, and it's set up the same way. This is your sense of touch that you have. And you can see we have a lot of receptors as far as the sense of touch is concerned in our face. Okay, especially mainly in our lips that we have. Our fingers have a lot of receptors that are associated with them as well. So, but our face, our head region has a lot of area that's dedicated to being able to interpret this information from these sensory neurons that are going towards our brain, and then being interpreted by these association neurons in the sensory cortex that we have. Your lips that you can see here, if you think about your lips have great feeling in them. They have a lot of sensory capabilities, a feeling of touch, because you want to know what's going inside of your mouth. Whereas if you look at your elbow's relatively big for its size, and your elbow doesn't have a lot of area that's associated with it on the brain. And if you think about it, you can like really squeeze on your elbow and stuff like that, and you really don't distinguishing that same amount of pain that you would have on your lips. So you can see this is kind of how it's set up on these two, the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, dealing with the amount of space depending upon the body part. And the motor cortex controls your motor movement of your skeletal muscle, and then the sensory cortex is going to be dealing with being able to interpret that sense of touch, is what it's going to have the ability to do. So again, just to reiterate, your sensory cortex is going to receive these impulses from the body's sensory receptors. And like I said, your head region tends to have a lot of receptors associated with it, which is why there's more area on that sensory cortex dedicated to it. And then the motor area is going to be the area that's going to send these impulses out to your skeletal muscles, to these motor neurons, where it's going to cause that muscle to contract. And your face, again, has a lot of skeletal muscle associated with it, so you have like a lot of different movements that you can do. These weird movements that I can do with my face so that I can interpret emotion and stuff like that. Now we have another area down here that's called Broca's area that I'm going to talk about next. So when we look at the brain, right here on the frontal lobe is Broca's area. So right here on the frontal lobe is Broca's area. And what Broca's area is dealing with is our speech, our motor speech. So our physical ability to speak is what Broca's area is going to do. It gives us our ability to speak is what it's going to do. Now there's another area that's back here on the temporal lobe that's located right in this area here, and it's called Wernicke's area. So you have Wernicke's area, and then you have Broca's area that I'm going to label with a B. Broca's area is our physical ability to speak, our motor speech, and then Wernicke's area is our ability to interpret these words. So Wernicke's area allows us to interpret what's being said, and then our ability to speak is controlled by Broca's areas. Now we have these whole type of problems that we can have that we call aphasias. And aphasias are problems with being able to speak, is what we have. So we have a Wernicke's aphasia, and we have a Broca's aphasia. A lot of these can be stroke-oriented when this area becomes damaged as a result of the stroke. A person that has Wernicke's aphasia isn't able to interpret what's being said. So an individual with Wernicke's aphasia isn't going to be able to interpret what's being said, but they can still have speech. So I might ask them, like, hey, how are you doing today? And they might respond, you know, the Browns won, or you look pretty. It doesn't make any sense, but their words come out, but the words aren't related to what's being said. So they have what's called Wernicke's aphasia. And Broca's aphasia, okay, Wernicke's area is still in function, but you lost the ability to speak, or you have trouble finding the correct word. So a person with Broca's aphasia, you might ask them a question, you know, like, hey, what do you do for a living? And they might say, like, McDonald's, 7 years. They're missing some key words in that sentence. You know what they want to say. I worked at McDonald's for 7 years, but it might be like McDonald's, and then 7 years is what might come after that. So you kind of have to piece together that particular statement. So again, Wernicke's area is located right here. It allows us to understand what's being said. And then Broca's area allows us to communicate with that motor speech that's right there. Now, this area here that's outlined by these little tiny dots is our general interpretation area. And what that means is we have all this sensory information that's coming in. And this information that comes into our brain, we kind of want to put it to one concise thought is what we want to do. And that's what this general area right here does in the brain right here. It's called our general interpretation area. So this general interpretation area is going to allow us to take these words or these senses that are coming in, or this sensory information that's coming in, and put it into one concise thought so that it can be processed. We've talked about the primary motor area. Okay, we talked about the sensory area that's right here. Gustori's area is our sense of taste, and it's located at the base of the sensory cortex. So at the base of the sensory cortex, this is where our taste is going to be interpreted at in our brain. In our temporal lobe, we also have an area right here. That's our auditory area. Okay, that's where our hearing is going to be processed at. Our sense of smell is also taken care of in the temporal lobe as well. Vision is our other sense that we have. Our visual cortex is in our occipital lobe. So our visual cortex is located in our occipital lobe. This is where we process that sight information, is on the back of our brain in the occipital lobe. So that takes care of all of our senses that we have. So to reiterate, taste was in the temporal, So taste was temporal. We'll put a T by it for temporal. So taste was temporal. I'm sorry, taste was not temporal. Taste was parietal. That we had the base of the sensory cortex. Taste is parietal. Our visual area was our occipital lobe. So our visual area was our occipital lobe. Auditory area was our temporal lobe. And our olfactory area that we had, our sense of smell, was also going to be processed in our temporal lobe.